blooming amidst thorns. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom when Vivian Hayes first stepped into the Blackwood Gallery opening. Pink petals drifted through the spring air like snow, catching in her chestnut hair as she hesitated at the entrance. The small-town kindergarten teacher felt profoundly out of place among Portland's elite, clutching her second-hand dress and wondering if coming had been a mistake. First time at one of these stuffy events? A warm voice startled her from behind. Vivian turned to find a tall man with kind eyes and an easy smile that contrasted with his impeccable suit. He offered her a glass of champagne, which she declined with a gentle shake of her head. "That obvious, huh?" she replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Refreshingly so," he said. "I'm Julian Blackwood." Her eyes widened slightly. "The artist?" His laugh was genuine. "Just the gallery owner. The artists are the real talents." That first meeting blossomed into coffee the following morning, then dinner the next week. Julian was captivated by Vivian's genuine passion for her students and her ability to find wonder in the smallest things. She fell for his thoughtful nature, the way he listened as though her words were precious, and how he spoke about art as a bridge between worlds. Their courtship was swift but sincere. Within 6 months, Julian proposed beneath the same cherry trees where they'd first talked about dreams and childhoods and favorite colors. "My family won't approve," he warned her one evening as they walked along the waterfront. "The Blackwoods have certain expectations." Vivian squeezed his hand. "Are their expectations more important than your happiness?" "Not to me," he answered without hesitation. The introduction to the Blackwood family went exactly as Julian had predicted. His mother, Eleanor, greeted Vivian with a glacial smile that never reached her eyes. His father, Richard, barely acknowledged her presence, while his younger sister, Penelope, made thinly veiled comments about fortune hunters and social climbers. "She's after the Blackwood name, darling," Eleanor told Julian over dinner, speaking as though Vivian weren't seated right beside him. "A kindergarten teacher from—" Where was it again? Oak Ridge? How quaint. Julian's jaw tightened. "Mother, enough!" Richard Blackwood finally looked up from his plate. "The prenuptial agreement will be extensive, of course." "There won't be one," Julian stated firmly. "I trust Vivian completely." Later that night, in the privacy of Julian's downtown loft, Vivian cried silently as he held her. "Maybe they're right. We come from different worlds." Julian lifted her chin with gentle fingers. "Then we'll build our own world." They married in a small ceremony by the sea. The Blackwoods attended with rigid smiles and cold eyes, their disapproval hanging heavy in the salt air. Only Julian's college roommate, Thomas Reed, now a promising young attorney, seemed genuinely happy for them. The newlyweds moved into a modest home on the edge of the Blackwood estate, close enough for Julian to manage the family's various art galleries, but far enough to create their own sanctuary. For 11 beautiful months, they lived in their carefully constructed bubble of happiness. Julian taught Vivian about wine and art history. She introduced him to the simple joys of picnics and cloud watching with her kindergartners. They dreamed of children, of turning part of the imposing Blackwood mansion into a creative learning center for underprivileged kids. Julian had begun drafting plans to present to his parents, convinced that seeing Vivian's genuine goodness would eventually thaw their icy hearts. "They'll come around," he promised her on their last morning together. "Once they truly know you, they'll love you too." How could anyone not? Vivian never forgot those words or the tender kiss he placed on her forehead before heading out to a gallery meeting in Seattle. She carried them with her like a talisman when the police knocked on her door later that evening, their faces solemn as gathering storm clouds. The rain fell mercilessly as Julian's car hydroplaned off the coastal highway, taking with it all their shared dreams of tomorrow. The darkest hour, the rain hadn't stopped since Julian's funeral. 3 weeks of relentless downpour that matched the hollow ache in Vivian's chest as she moved through their home like a ghost. Sleep came in fitful bursts, always ending with her reaching across empty sheets, momentarily forgetting before remembering all over again. The Blackwoods had arranged a lavish service that felt nothing like the man Vivian had loved. Eleanor orchestrated everything with mechanical efficiency, relegating Vivian to the periphery. "Family in the front row?" she'd instructed, pointedly excluding her daughter-in-law from that definition. Vivian had stood in the second row, clutching a single yellow tulip, Julian's favorite, while Richard delivered a eulogy that spoke of legacy and bloodlines, but nothing of Julian's compassion or his dreams. Only Thomas Reed had acknowledged her grief, squeezing her hand briefly as he passed. "Julian would have hated this circus," he whispered, the first words that had felt true all day. On the 23rd day after Julian's death, the formal letter arrived. The Blackwood family attorney requested Vivian's presence to discuss matters of inheritance and the estate. She arrived at the imposing oak-paneled office to find not only the attorney but the entire Blackwood family waiting like vultures. "Mrs. Blackwood," the attorney began, his voice clinical, "I regret to inform you that certain elements of your husband's will are being contested." Eleanor's thin smile cut like glass. "We believe Julian wasn't of sound mind when he made such generous provisions for someone he'd known less than 2 years." "You're challenging the will?" Vivian whispered, her voice faltering. Richard Blackwood leaned forward. "My son was manipulated. The idea that he would leave you controlling interest in our family galleries and property rights to the guest house is absurd." "We're prepared to offer you a settlement," Penelope added, sliding a document across the table. $100,000. More than fair for a year's companionship. The words struck like physical blows. They were reducing her marriage, her love, to a transaction. "A service rendered. Julian wanted to start a school," Vivian said softly, "for children who couldn't afford art education. That's all I want to do with what he left me." Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "How convenient. A kindergarten teacher inheriting millions to start a school. At least concoct a more original story." Thomas Reed, who had been silently observing from the corner, finally spoke. "I can confirm Julian's intentions. He discussed the school with me extensively." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You've always harbored a soft spot for strays, Thomas. It's unbecoming in an attorney." "This is wrong," Thomas said firmly. "Julian made his wishes clear. Nevertheless," the family attorney continued, "the Blackwoods are within their legal rights to challenge the will. The court date is set for next month." Vivian left the meeting in a daze, the settlement offer untouched. Outside, rain continued to fall as Thomas caught up with her under the building's awning. "They're going to destroy me," she murmured, watching droplets explode on the pavement. Thomas studied her for a long moment. "Only if you let them." "Julian believed in you, Vivian. He told me once that you had more strength than anyone he'd ever met. You just didn't know it yet. I don't know anything about legal battles or inheritance law. You don't have to." Thomas handed her his card. "I do. Let me help you fight them. I can't afford someone like you, Thomas. You couldn't afford me if I were charging," he corrected with the first hint of a smile she'd seen in weeks. "But I'm not. Consider it a debt I owe Julian." That night, for the first time since Julian's death, Vivian didn't cry herself to sleep. Instead, she pulled out the sketchbooks where Julian had drawn his vision for the school, classroom layouts, garden spaces, studios filled with light. She traced his handwriting with trembling fingers, reading his notes about accessibility and scholarships. "They didn't know you at all," she whispered to the empty room. "But I did, and I won't let them erase what you wanted." The following weeks passed in a blur of depositions and paperwork. The Blackwoods' legal team was relentless, demanding financial records from Vivian's entire life, interviewing her former colleagues and even her students' parents, searching for any evidence that she had targeted Julian for his wealth. They found none, but that didn't stop the whispers. Somehow, details of the case leaked to local media. The Portland Society pages ran thinly veiled hit pieces portraying Vivian as a calculating gold digger who had seduced the heir to one of the city's oldest families. Kindergarten teachers set sights on Blackwood millions, screamed one particularly vicious headline. The morning the trial began, Vivian's phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. It contained only a picture of her car with the word "whore" scratched into the driver's door. No message, just the image. Her hands shook so badly she dropped the phone. Thomas found her sitting on her front steps, too afraid to drive the vandalized car but too proud to call and tell him why. It's just a scare tactic, he said, examining the damage. The Blackwoods would never do this directly, but they have friends who would. How am I supposed to face them in court today? Thomas offered his hand, pulling her to her feet. With your head high. That's exactly what they don't expect. Courtroom tempest. The courtroom felt cavernous, every whisper magnified as Vivian walked down the center aisle with Thomas at her side. The Blackwood family occupied the plaintiff's table like royalty holding court. Eleanor wore a tailored black suit that somehow conveyed both mourning and battle armor. Richard's silver hair caught the light, lending him a distinguished air that belied his cruel determination. Penelope's red-soled heels clicked impatiently against the wooden floor. Their lead attorney, Harrison Wells, was a legendary litigator whose services commanded fees that could have funded several of Julian's dream schools. Thomas Reed, despite his brilliance, was outgunned by their three-person legal team, and everyone in the room knew it. All rise for the Honorable Judge Caroline Mitchell. The judge, a severe-looking woman in her 60s with shrewd eyes, surveyed the courtroom before nodding. Be seated. Case number 87543, Blackwood v. Blackwood regarding the contested will of Julian Alexander Blackwood. Opening statements, please. Harrison Wells rose with predatory grace. Your Honor, this is a simple case of undue influence. Julian Blackwood, sole heir to the Blackwood art empire, met the defendant, a kindergarten teacher earning $42,000 annually, and within months had changed his will to leave her millions in assets and property. The timeline alone suggests manipulation. Wells proceeded to paint Julian as naive and vulnerable following a previous broken engagement, ripe for exploitation by a woman who saw an opportunity and seized it. When Thomas rose for the defense, his voice was steady but lacking Wells' theatrical flourish. Your Honor, this case is indeed simple, but not for the reasons Mr. Wells suggests. It's simple because Julian Blackwood was a grown man who knew exactly what he was doing when he married Vivian and changed his will. He wasn't manipulated. He was in love. The first day established the battle lines clearly. The Blackwoods had money, social connections, and a narrative that appealed to cynicism. Of course, the teacher had married for money. What else could explain it? Thomas had truth and a handful of witnesses who knew the real Julian. It didn't feel like enough. On the third day, Eleanor Blackwood took the stand, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief as she described how Julian changed after meeting her. He became secretive, defensive. She isolated him from his family. Mrs. Blackwood, Thomas asked during cross-examination, how many times did you invite Vivian and Julian to family dinners after they were married? Eleanor blinked. I don't recall the exact number. Would it surprise you if Julian's personal calendar showed 0 invitations? We were busy with gallery expansions, she sniffed. So busy that you couldn't meet your son's wife properly? Or perhaps you'd already decided she wasn't worthy of your time. Objection, Wells barked. Badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge Mitchell ruled. Mr. Reed, confine yourself to questions, not commentary. Day by day, the Blackwoods built their case through insinuation and character assassination. They brought former boyfriends who testified about Vivian's interest in security and produced financial records showing she'd been struggling with student loan debt when she met. Julian worst was the day they called Julian's personal assistant, who revealed under oath that she'd overheard Vivian once say, I never have to worry about money again on a phone call. She said it laughing. The assistant added, voice dripping with judgment. Vivian sat rigid, remembering that call perfectly. She'd been talking to her mother about how Julian insisted she quit her second job tutoring on weekends because I never have to worry about money again, and I can finally just focus on my kindergartners. The assistant had only heard half the conversation and twisted it into something ugly. By the second week, Vivian was emotionally exhausted. The daily gauntlet of reporters shouting questions, the whispers that followed her through the courthouse, and the clinical dissection of her marriage was taking its toll. Thomas noticed her fading resilience. Tomorrow's important, he told her over coffee in his modest office. Wells is calling Richard Blackwood, then you'll be up after lunch. What if I can't do this, Thomas? He considered her for a long moment. Julian told me something once when I asked why he was so certain about marrying you after knowing you such a short time. Vivian looked up, hungry for any piece of Julian she hadn't heard. He said, "She has this still water strength. Not the showy kind that roars and crashes, but the kind that runs deep and steady and eventually reshapes mountains. That's what we need tomorrow." Your still water strength. That night, Vivian couldn't sleep. Instead, she dug through boxes she'd avoided since Julian's death. Photographs, letters, the silly drawings they'd made for each other. Among them, she found something she'd forgotten. Julian's journal. The one he'd kept in the months they were dating and through their early marriage. Heart pounding, she opened it and began to read. The Scales of Justice. The day Vivian took the stand dawned crisp and clear, the first sunshine in weeks breaking through Portland's perpetual cloud cover. She wore a simple navy dress Julian had once complimented, her hair pulled back, Julian's journal safely tucked in her bag. Thomas met her on the courthouse steps, concern etched on his face. "You didn't sleep," he observed. "I found something better than sleep." She patted her bag. "I found Julian's voice." Inside, Richard Blackwood was finishing his testimony, his commanding presence filling the courtroom as he described his deep concerns about Julian's relationship with Vivian. "My son was always idealistic," Richard stated with practiced regret. "He believed the best in people, even when evidence suggested caution. We tried to protect him, but he was determined to make his own mistakes," Wells supplied sympathetically. "Yes, though I never imagined it would cost him everything." During cross-examination, Thomas pressed Richard on the family's treatment of Vivian. "Mr. Blackwood, did Julian ever directly tell you he was unhappy in his marriage?" "No, but did he ever express regret about changing his will?" "Not in those words, however." "Did you ever once congratulate your son on his marriage?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I was concerned for his well-being." "That's not what I asked, sir." "Did you, Julian's father, ever once wish him happiness in his marriage?" A heavy silence filled the courtroom before Richard finally answered, "No." The afternoon session began with Vivian taking the stand. Wells approached like a shark scenting blood, his expensive suit seeming to ripple as he moved. "Mrs. Blackwood, or may I call you Miss Hayes? Given the brevity of your marriage, it seems more appropriate." Thomas stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is deliberately attempting to delegitimize the defendant's marriage." "Sustained," Judge Mitchell said sharply. "Mr. Wells, refer to the defendant properly." Wells smiled thinly. "Mrs. Blackwood, you were a kindergarten teacher when you met Julian, correct?" "I still am a kindergarten teacher," Vivian corrected quietly. "I took leave after Julian's death, but I'll be returning next semester." "How interesting. Despite potentially inheriting millions, you plan to return to a job paying under $50,000 annually?" "Teaching isn't about money, Mr. Wells. It's about purpose." For nearly 2 hours, Wells circled and struck, trying to trap Vivian in contradictions or force emotional outbursts. He questioned her financial history, her previous relationships, even her childhood in a middle-class home. "So you've never experienced wealth until meeting Julian Blackwood?" "No, I hadn't." "And you found it appealing? The galleries, the mansion, the social circles?" Vivian hesitated. "Some parts were nice, but mostly I loved that Julian wanted to use his position to help children who couldn't afford art education." Wells pounced. "Ah, yes, this mysterious school plan the defense keeps mentioning. Convenient that the deceased isn't here to confirm these charitable intentions." Something in Vivian finally snapped. "Julian left more than enough confirmation, if anyone had bothered to actually know him." "Objection," Wells said smoothly. Non-responsive. Judge Mitchell studied Vivian. "I'll allow it. The witness may elaborate." Vivian glanced at Thomas, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. She reached into her bag and withdrew Julian's journal. "Julian kept journals his whole life," she said, her voice gaining strength. "This one covers the months we were together. He wrote extensively about the school, about our future plans." She looked directly at Eleanor Blackwood. "About his hope that his family would eventually accept me." Wells looked momentarily thrown. "Your Honor, this journal wasn't included in discovery." Thomas stood. "Because we only located it last night, Your Honor. We're prepared to submit it immediately for authentication and review." The judge called a 30-minute recess to examine the journal. When court resumed, she announced, "The journal appears genuine and contains relevant information. I'll allow limited questioning regarding its contents." Vivian read Julian's words describing his growing disillusionment with his family's elitism, and his excitement about transforming part of the Blackwood estate into a place where art belongs to everyone, not just those born to privilege. Most devastatingly, she read his private assessment of his parents' treatment of Vivian. "They can't see past their own prejudice to recognize that she's the best thing that ever happened to me. Their loss. If they force me to choose, they won't like my decision." By the time Thomas began his redirect questioning, the courtroom's atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. "Mrs. Blackwood, why do you want to honor Julian's wishes regarding the school?" Vivian looked toward the Blackwoods, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Because Julian believed art saved him from becoming what was expected of him. He wanted other children to have that chance." Eleanor Blackwood laughed audibly. Several jurors turned to stare. Thomas continued, "And what would you say to the suggestion that you married Julian for his money?" Vivian wiped her tears, straightening. "I'd say they never knew their son at all if they think money was his most valuable quality." The room fell silent. Even Wells didn't interrupt. "I loved Julian for his kindness, for the way he sat on tiny kindergarten chairs to read to my students, for how he remembered every child's name and favorite color," her voice broke, "for how he believed everyone deserved beauty in their lives, not just the wealthy." Wells began a brutal cross-examination, but the damage was done. When he pushed too hard, asking Vivian if she'd rehearsed that touching speech, she finally broke completely. "Do you think I wanted any of this?" she cried, years of pain flooding out. "Do you think I wanted to lose my husband, to be humiliated and called a gold digger, to have whore scratched into my car door, to sit here while you destroy every beautiful thing we planned together?" The courtroom erupted. Eleanor's expression flickered with something almost like shame before hardening again. Judge Mitchell hammered her gavel repeatedly. "Order! We will have order!" As Vivian stepped down shaking, Thomas caught her arm to steady her. "Still waters," he whispered, "reshaping mountains." 3 days later, after closing arguments and jury deliberation, the verdict came. The will would stand. Julian's wishes would be honored. The Blackwood family had lost. Legacy of light autumn leaves crunched beneath Vivian's boots as she walked the winding path toward the Blackwood mansion. Her mansion now, according to the court. Thomas Reed walked beside her, both of them silent as they approached the imposing structure that had been at the center of so much pain. 2 years had passed since the verdict. 2 years of appeals and legal maneuvering by the Blackwoods, all ultimately unsuccessful. 2 years of healing and planning and remembering how to breathe again. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked as they paused at the ornate front gates. Vivian nodded, taking in the sweeping grounds with new eyes. Julian would have loved today. The renovation crews had worked for months, transforming the east wing of the mansion into the Julian Blackwood Center for Creative Arts. Classrooms replaced formal dining rooms. Studios with north-facing windows occupied what had once been stuffy sitting rooms. The austere ballroom had become a gallery space where children's artwork hung alongside priceless paintings from the Blackwood collection. Eleanor and Richard had moved to their Aspen estate after the final appeal failed, unable to bear the transformation of their ancestral home. Only Penelope had reached out, surprising everyone with a brief note congratulating Vivian on having more backbone than we gave you credit for. Today was the grand opening. Yellow school buses lined the long driveway, disgorging excited children from Portland's most underserved neighborhoods. Teachers guided them toward the entrance where a simple plaque read, "Art belongs to everyone. Julian A. Blackwood." Mrs. Hayes. A small girl with braids broke free from her group, running toward Vivian. "Is it true we get to paint with real artist paint today?" Vivian knelt to the child's level. "Real artist paint, real canvases, real everything, just like the professionals use." The girl's eyes widened. "In that big fancy house?" "Especially in that big fancy house," Vivian confirmed. "That's exactly where it belongs." As the children filed inside, Thomas touched Vivian's elbow gently. "I just got a text from the caterers. Everything's set for the donor reception later." The center operated on a mixture of the trust Julian had established and donations from Portland's art community. Surprisingly, several longtime Blackwood associates had quietly aligned with Vivian after the trial, impressed by her determination to honor Julian's vision despite overwhelming opposition. "I still can't believe we pulled this off," Vivian murmured as they followed the children inside. Thomas smiled, the expression warming his serious features. "I can. Julian knew exactly what he was doing when he left everything to you." They paused. In the main foyer, where a portrait of Julian now hung, his kind eyes seeming to watch over the proceedings. Beneath it, a quotation from his journal had been inscribed. "True legacy isn't measured in wealth preserved, but in possibilities created." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity: art classes, tours for potential donors, interviews with local press. Vivian moved through it all with a quiet grace that belied the tumult of the past 3 years. Only Thomas noticed how she occasionally touched her wedding ring, still worn on a chain around her neck, or how she sometimes glanced at Julian's portrait as if seeking his approval. As evening approached and the last school buses departed, Vivian found a quiet moment alone in what had once been Julian's father's study, now transformed into a multimedia lab. Thomas found her there, gazing out the window at the garden where they planned to install a sculpture created by the center's first class of students. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, loosening his tie. "I was just thinking about that day in court," she replied, "when Eleanor laughed at me. One of the jurors told me later that was the moment she knew they were going to rule in your favor." Vivian turned from the window. "I've been angry for so long, Thomas. At them, at fate, at the unfairness of losing Julian. But standing here today, watching those children's faces," she gestured around them, "this feels like letting go of the anger finally. Like something beautiful grew from all that pain." Thomas moved closer, his expression unguarded. "Julian would be proud of you. I know I am." The quiet moment between them hummed with unspoken possibilities. They had grown close over the past 2 years, their relationship evolving from lawyer and client to friends, and finally to something neither had fully acknowledged. "The donor reception starts in 20 minutes, Thomas reminded her gently. "I know." Vivian hesitated. "Thomas, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." "Anything." "The apartment above the carriage house, Julian's old studio. I've been thinking of renovating it for the new art director we're hiring." Thomas nodded, professional mode engaging. "Makes sense. It's sitting empty." "That's just it," Vivian continued. "I don't think it should be empty anymore." She met his gaze directly. "Your lease is up next month. You mentioned your buildings being sold." Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. "Vivian, are you asking me to move on to the estate?" "I'm asking you to consider it," she clarified. "No pressure, no expectations, just proximity." A slow smile spread across Thomas's face. "Proximity sounds like a good place to start." Before he could say more, the event coordinator appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Blackwood, the first donors are arriving." "We'll be right there," Vivian promised. As the coordinator hurried away, she turned back to Thomas. I still go by Hayes professionally, you know. But I kept Blackwood legally because it connects me to Julian and to all of this. She gestured around them. Thomas took her hand, squeezing it gently. Names are just labels. It's what we build that matters. Together they walked toward the grand entrance where Portland's elite now gathered, not to judge or exclude as they once had, but to support the vision that had been born from heartbreak and vindication. As they greeted the guests, Vivian caught sight of her reflection in one of the mansion's ornate mirrors. The soft-spoken schoolteacher who had once been intimidated by these grand rooms was gone. In her place stood a woman who had fought for what she believed in and won. Not just a mansion, but the right to transform pain into purpose. Outside, the autumn sun set behind distant mountains, casting the entire estate in golden light. Within those gilded walls, a legacy bloomed that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with possibility.